The first letter showed up taped to my front door while I was out watering the roses, and I remember standing there in my socks, hose still running across the lawn, reading this absurd little notice from the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association telling me I had 30 days to correct hazardous landscaping violations or face escalating fines. Hazardous landscaping. That's what they called the tree. The tree that had been standing there since before California was even part of the United States. The tree that shaded half the block every summer. The tree that made me stop my truck the first time I saw the house and think, yeah, this is home. I actually laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, but because I genuinely thought somebody on the board was overreacting and we'd clear it up in 5 minutes. I had no idea that stupid little notice was about to turn into a 2-year war that would cost the HOA over 60 grand and basically destroy the woman who started it. The tree itself was this massive valley oak planted dead center in my front yard, trunk so wide 3 grown men couldn't wrap their arms around it, branches stretching over the sidewalk and part of the street like some kind of cathedral ceiling made out of leaves. Kids walked under it every morning on their way to school. During summer, people parked under it because the shade dropped the temperature by 10 degrees easy. Old neighbors used to tell me the original ranch house on the land burned down sometime in the 1800s, and somehow that oak survived the fire. Everybody in the neighborhood had pictures of it somewhere in their family albums. Everybody except Diane Mercer. Now Diane was the HOA president, and if you've ever lived under an HOA, you already know the type. Perfect haircut, permanently offended expression, drove a white Lexus that somehow looked judgmental. She treated the neighborhood like she was running a tiny country nobody asked to live in. At first, she pretended the issue was safety. She cornered me outside one afternoon while I was dragging trash cans back up the driveway and said, "Elliot, your tree is becoming a liability for the community." Community. She always stretched that word out like she was speaking on behalf of civilization itself. I said, "The tree's been here longer than any of us." She smiled at me in this cold little way and said, "That doesn't make it exempt from maintenance." A week later, I got the official order. Cut the canopy back 15 feet on all sides. 15 feet. I actually called an arborist buddy of mine after reading it, and he just whistled into the phone and said, "Yeah, that'd probably kill it." That's when I realized this wasn't about maintenance at all. See, a few months before all this started, the HOA had announced plans to widen the street near the entrance of the neighborhood because people complained about parking during holiday parties. Diane was obsessed with making Maple Ridge look upscale, which usually meant removing anything old, uneven, or remotely natural and replacing it with decorative concrete and those sad little ornamental trees that look dead even when they're alive. One night after an HOA meeting, my neighbor Walter pulled me aside in the parking lot and quietly said, "You know they've been talking about that oak for months, right?" I said, "Talking about what?" He looked over his shoulder before answering, "Removing it." And suddenly everything started making sense. The sidewalk complaints, the roots, the leaves, the notices. They didn't want the tree trimmed. They wanted it gone because the roots sat exactly where they planned to expand the curb line. I still remember sitting on my porch that night staring up into the branches moving in the wind, hearing the creaking sounds old oaks make when the temperature drops. And honestly, I got angry in a way that surprised me. Not just because of the tree, but because of what it represented. That oak was one of the last things in the neighborhood that hadn't been flattened, polished, and turned into something artificial by people obsessed with property values. And the worst part was, Diane knew exactly what she was doing. 3 days later, she showed up at my door holding another notice and said, "If the trimming isn't completed by the deadline, fines will begin immediately." I asked her, "You ever think maybe not everything old needs to be destroyed?" She gave me this little shrug and said, "Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions." That was the moment I stopped trying to cooperate. And that was the moment I started making phone calls. The funny thing is, once I stopped arguing with Diane, she got even meaner. I think she enjoyed the fight more than the actual issue. Some people get addicted to power in these tiny suburban kingdoms they build for themselves, and the second you stop reacting, they start pushing harder just to feel something. The fine started at $300, then $600, then $1,200. Every couple weeks, another envelope showed up in my mailbox like clockwork, stamped with bright red lettering meant to scare me into compliance. Final notice. Urgent action required. Community safety violation. Real dramatic stuff for a tree that had survived lightning strikes and droughts longer than their little HOA had existed. And I paid every single fine. Didn't complain. Didn't appeal. Didn't even respond. That part drove Diane insane. One morning she caught me outside while I was washing my truck and said, "You understand these penalties will continue increasing indefinitely?" I just nodded and said, "I understand." She narrowed her eyes at me like she was waiting for a reaction that never came. Looking back now, I think that's when she started getting nervous. Because while she thought she was pressuring me into surrendering, I was already 3 steps ahead of her. About a week earlier, I'd gotten in touch with a county arborist named Mateo Alvarez. Older guy, weathered face, hands like somebody who actually worked for a living. He showed up in this dusty county pickup carrying measuring tools and core sampling equipment. And the second he saw the oak, he just stopped in the middle of my driveway and let out this low whistle. "Good Lord," he said, walking slowly toward it. "You don't see many like this anymore." For almost 4 hours he inspected that tree like a doctor examining a patient. Measured the trunk diameter, checked the root flare, took soil samples, looked for fungal damage, climbed halfway into the canopy with this little flashlight clenched between his teeth. At one point I asked him if the tree was unhealthy, and he looked offended I'd even asked. "Unhealthy," he said. "This thing's a monument." Then he explained something I'd never heard before. Apparently our county had a heritage preservation ordinance protecting historically significant trees. Most people never bothered applying because the process was expensive and annoying, but if a tree met certain requirements, age, species rarity, historical significance, it could receive permanent landmark status. Protected from removal. Protected from severe trimming. Protected from construction disturbance. Protected from basically everything. I remember trying not to sound too hopeful when I asked, "You think this oak qualifies?" Mateo actually laughed. "Son," he said, patting the bark with one hand, "this tree was alive while Thomas Jefferson was still writing letters." A few days later he called me with the official estimate. 340 years old. 340. I sat there at my kitchen table staring at the report while the coffee in my hand went cold. That tree had already lived through wars, economic crashes, earthquakes, wildfires, and now it was being threatened by a woman named Diane who got upset about leaves on sidewalks. So I filed the application. Quietly. Didn't tell the HOA. Didn't warn anybody. And while all this was happening, Maple Ridge was charging full speed ahead on their street expansion project. Surveyors started showing up near the entrance measuring pavement lines. Little colored flags appeared in the grass. Construction companies came through taking photos. I'd sit on my porch in the evenings pretending to read while watching them work around the oak like they didn't even realize what was coming. Then one night Walter came over carrying a 6-pack and sat beside me on the porch swing. "You know how much they already spent on that road project?" he asked. "Nope. 20 grand deposit. Non-refundable." I looked over at him. "Seriously?" He nodded. Diane convinced everybody property values would go up if they added guest parking. I remember taking this long sip of beer, trying very hard not to smile. 3 weeks later, the county approved the landmark designation. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Officially recognized heritage tree. I must have read that sentence 20 times. Then I walked outside and just stood beneath the canopy looking up through the branches moving in the sunlight. And I swear for a second, I actually felt emotional. Not because I'd won yet, but because that tree finally had somebody defending it with actual authority behind them. The next HOA meeting happened 4 days later. And that was where everything exploded. I almost didn't go, but Walter convinced me. "Trust me," he said, grinning like a man about to watch fireworks. "You want to be there for this." The clubhouse was packed that night. Folding chairs full of irritated homeowners arguing about parking spaces and landscaping fees, while Diane stood near the front shuffling papers with that same tight little expression she always wore. Then the construction consultant got up to give the project update. And halfway through his presentation, he suddenly stopped talking. Actually stopped mid-sentence. I watched him lean toward Diane and whisper something in her ear. Her entire face changed instantly. Confusion first, then disbelief, then panic. She grabbed the papers out of his hands so aggressively one of them fell onto the floor. "What do you mean protected?" she snapped loud enough for everybody to hear. The consultant awkwardly cleared his throat and said, "County heritage designation was finalized this week." The room got quiet fast. Diane looked around like somebody had just informed her there was a bomb in the building. The root protection zone overlaps the proposed construction area. The consultant continued carefully. Any excavation within 50 feet now requires environmental review and mitigation approval. Walter leaned over beside me and whispered, "Oh, she's going to stroke out." I shouldn't have laughed, but I did. Diane immediately turned toward me across the room, and I'll never forget that look. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was betrayal. Like somehow I'd violated an unspoken rule by not rolling over for her. "You did this intentionally," she said. And honestly, the whole room kind of froze waiting for my answer. I remember standing up slowly and saying, "No, Diane. The county did this intentionally. They're trying to protect a 300-year-old tree." A few people actually clapped. Not many, but enough. That's when Diane completely lost control. She started ranting about infrastructure, liability exposure, public safety, community planning. All these big official-sounding phrases people use when they know they're losing an argument. The consultant kept trying to calm her down while quietly explaining the reality nobody wanted to hear. The project was effectively dead. No contractor wanted to touch it now because violating heritage protections carried massive penalties. Environmental review alone would take months. Root mitigation costs would be insane. The county arborist had already flagged the oak as exceptionally significant due to age and condition. And worst of all, the $20,000 deposit was gone. Non-refundable. You could actually feel the mood in the room shift once homeowners realized what happened. Because up until then, this had been framed as Elliot refusing to maintain his landscaping. Now suddenly it looked very different. Now it looked like the HOA board had spent neighborhood money trying to bully a homeowner into removing a protected historical landmark. And people were furious. Diane tried recovering by saying, "This obstruction has damaged the entire community." That's when old Mrs. Holloway from 2 streets over stood up and said, "That tree was here before any of us. Maybe the road should have moved." The whole room went dead silent. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I realized Diane might actually lose. After that meeting, Maple Ridge turned into a pressure cooker. You could feel it every time somebody walked their dog past my house, every time neighbors stopped talking when Diane drove by, every time another HOA email landed in everybody's inbox trying to clarify misinformation regarding the preservation issue. That's what they started calling it. The preservation issue. Like the tree was some kind of disease outbreak instead of the one beautiful thing left in a neighborhood slowly drowning in beige paint and fake stone entry signs. For a while, Diane tried pretending she still had control of the situation. She filed an appeal with the county claiming the oak posed a structural hazard, which honestly would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. Mateo came back out for another inspection, spent maybe 20 minutes looking around, then submitted a report basically saying the tree was healthier than half the landscaping approved by the HOA. That really seemed to break something in her, because after the county denied the appeal, she stopped acting like a board president and started acting personal. One afternoon, she marched onto my driveway while I was raking leaves and said, "Do you have any idea how much money this neighborhood lost because of you?" I leaned on the rake and said, "Pretty sure the neighborhood lost money because nobody checked county records before signing contracts." Her face tightened immediately. "You weaponized the ordinance." And I remember looking past her toward the oak branches swaying over the street and thinking how insane that sentence sounded out loud. Finally, I said, "Diane, protecting a heritage tree is literally what the ordinance is for." She stared at me for a second like she wanted to slap me with the rake, then turned around and stormed off back to her Lexus. 2 weeks later, the lawsuit arrived. I wish I were joking. The HOA actually sued me for intentional interference with community development, basically claiming I knowingly sabotaged the road expansion project by pursuing landmark protection in bad faith. Even my attorney laughed reading it. His name was Greg Sullivan, old-school local lawyer, suspenders, coffee breath, looked permanently disappointed in humanity. He read the complaint twice, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Your HOA is either incredibly arrogant or incredibly stupid. Can they win?" I asked. He snorted. "Absolutely not. Still, lawsuits are stressful no matter how ridiculous they are. There's something deeply unsettling about seeing your own name on legal paperwork, especially when you know somebody genuinely wants to hurt you." For the first time during this whole ordeal, I actually started losing sleep. Some nights I'd sit on the porch around midnight listening to wind move through the oak leaves, wondering if I should have just trimmed the damn thing from the start. Then I'd picture bulldozers cutting through those roots and immediately get angry all over again. The hearing happened 3 months later. Small county courtroom, fluorescent lighting, uncomfortable wooden benches. The kind of place where everybody looks tired before anything even starts. Diane showed up dressed like she was attending a corporate funeral, carrying stacks of binders, and whispering aggressively to the HOA attorney. Greg took one look at their table and muttered, "Overcompensating. Good sign." And honestly, the hearing lasted maybe 40 minutes. The HOA attorney tried arguing that I acted maliciously by seeking heritage protection specifically to obstruct neighborhood improvements. He kept using phrases like bad faith conduct and intentional financial harm to the association. Then the judge interrupted him. I'll remember this moment for the rest of my life. The judge looked over his glasses and asked, "Counselor, are you arguing that protecting a historically significant tree is unlawful because your clients already paid a contractor?" The attorney started stumbling immediately. "Well, Your Honor, the timing suggests." "No," the judge cut in. "The timing suggests your clients failed to perform proper environmental review before spending association funds." You could actually hear somebody behind me trying not to laugh. Then the judge turned toward Diane's side of the room and delivered the line that basically ended the case right there. Heritage conservation is a legitimate property right in this county. Your association does not supersede county protection law simply because road widening became inconvenient. Dismissed. Just like that. I walked outside afterward feeling lighter than I had in almost a year, and Greg slapped me on the shoulder and said, "Congratulations. Your tree just beat an HOA." But the real fallout came afterward. Because lawsuits cost money. A lot of money. And Maple Ridge lost badly. Between legal fees, consultant costs, the failed construction deposit, and all the county review expenses, the HOA burned through something like $65,000 by the end of everything. Maybe more. And since the Association Reserve Fund couldn't absorb it, they issued a special assessment to every homeowner in the neighborhood. People lost their minds. Homeowners who never cared about the oaks suddenly cared very deeply once they got hit with multi-thousand-dollar assessment notices. Neighbors started demanding board resignations. Meetings turned into screaming matches. One guy apparently threatened to sue the HOA board personally for negligence. And right in the middle of all that chaos, Diane quietly put her house on the market. Walter was the one who told me. He came over grinning like Christmas morning and said, "Guess who's leaving Maple Ridge?" I looked past him toward the for sale sign sitting in front of Diane's house down the street, and honestly, I didn't feel victorious the way I thought I would. Mostly I just felt tired. Because the truth is, none of this should have happened in the first place. All they had to do was leave the tree alone. That was it. No lawsuits. No neighborhood civil war. No financial disaster. Just let an ancient living thing continue existing peacefully. But some people see age as an obstacle instead of history. And people like Diane always think control belongs to them right up until the moment it doesn't. These days things are quiet again around here. Kids still walk under the canopy every morning. During summer, cars still park in the shade. Every fall, the leaves still blanket the sidewalk so thick it looks like the whole street turned gold overnight. And yeah, I still rake them into neat little piles near the curb. Petty? Maybe. But after everything that happened, I've earned a little pettiness. Sometimes I sit on the porch at sunset looking up into those massive branches and think about how many people that tree has outlived already, and how many more it probably will. Honestly, there's something comforting about that. Anyway, I want to know what you guys think. Was I justified protecting the tree no matter what it cost the HOA? Or did I take things too far once I realized I could stop the entire project? And be honest, if you were living in that neighborhood, whose side would you actually be on? Let me know in the comments, because I guarantee this story would have divided every community in America.